Patience, nothing like this. So thanks everyone for coming, for being here on day 0 of the event. Very interested. I'm very curious about the Jenkins' YAML plugin. I guess JAML is going to be a thing now. We'll see what that evolves to. Kosuke obviously had a nice time not having to do much of a show of hands in terms of who knows Jenkins. Let me ask the question again. Who knows Spinnaker here? Who's heard of it? Oh, wow. Then maybe I don't have to do the whole demo after all. So I'm going to breeze through a couple of slides. I'd like to spend a bit of time kind of motivating some of the problem space in the background, and then also showing those of you who haven't seen Spinnaker a bit of a tour of the UI, if I can do so with my neck looking backwards at this screen that I can't see. But let me, just at a high level, so Spinnaker is an open source, as you can read there. It's a multi-cloud continuous delivery platform that, well, tries to do what continuous delivery tries to do, obviously. It's been around for a decent while. It came out of a bunch of internal work at Netflix. It's now an open source project led by Netflix and Google and a whole bunch of other companies who contribute to it. Before I dive deeply into some of the details of Spinnaker, I'd like to motivate the space a little bit. I think CI and CD as a term has become a sort of generic term for random automation that you do between checking in code and between getting to production. And I think that when we talk about the fact that Spinnaker focuses heavily on the application release part of the cycle, I usually use a diagram, something like this, to try to motivate what that means. Typically, I think if we think about what happens when we deploy code, or when we write code and then deploy code, there's kind of mentally 2 common types of processes that happen. First of all, I'm writing some code, I'm checking it into a branch, or I'm doing something locally. I, as a developer, want to get feedback on what I'm doing, what I would call like the developer feedback cycle. It could be called CI, it could be called lots of other things. But that's really about, that doesn't have any terrible side effects. That's just me trying out new code to see what happens in a relatively local or tested fashion. And then at some point, we feel confident that the thing we're working on is ready to go on a longer journey, maybe to take it to production. And then we shove it into the pipeline or whatever. And then it takes its wonderful path all the way to prod. And that doesn't mean to say that you can't do this on a one-on-one basis. Every time you commit a line of code, you try to take it to prod. But I think the reality is that very, very frequently those 2 things don't happen at the same frequency. And I think there's good reasons for those kind of things. Like if we think about CI, it's usually a relatively, side effecting. You write a bunch of test logs and so on. But in general, you run a bunch of commands and you do some optimization for parallelization. But if it goes wrong, it's not really a big deal. When you're talking about actually pushing your code closer and closer to production, there's some complex branching that starts to happen and sort of dependencies between things. And then, of course, side effects start to get increasingly worse. Like if it goes wrong, then you have to do a bunch of work to clean up. And those are just things maybe to motivate the fact that, and the long-running process, that even though we might use the same tooling for this, like nothing I'm saying here justifies the fact that you necessarily should use different tools for these processes, but it commonly happens that we think about them differently. And the goals are also a little bit different. When we're doing CI, we're trying to get as much information back to the developer as quickly as possible. When we're doing CD, we're trying to get code out to production safely without breaking too much. And I think that kind of explains why there's, what some of the challenges are in getting CD right in organizations or even in teams. On the one hand, you want it to be safe and somewhat standardized, because one of the elements of things that make it unsafe is every team doing something in a very different way. But on the other hand, you want it to be really easy and simple for developers to set up, because nobody likes having to adopt another tool that they don't know in order just to get your deployment out to production. And so trying to find a good balance between how do I make this simple for developers, how do I make this easy to set up, but how do I allow operations or DevOps or the platform team or whatever you call them to have enough safety and control so that the process doesn't break all the time, I think is a fundamental challenge of building good tools and processes in this space. And so there's kind of, when we break that down, or if we look at how Spinnaker breaks that down, there's really 3 parts to this overall problem. There's, how do I build the process that actually pushes the code out to production, what I might call application deployment? How do I understand what's running in production or what's running in staging right now? Because some of the decisions I have to make are dependent on that context. And if I want to troubleshoot, I really want to understand really well what's going on. So that might be more application management. And then there's deployment best practices. Sure, I can write a blue-green deployment or a canary deployment with Istio in a whole bunch of YAML. And in fact, I have a bit of a run through a couple of slides on how you might do that. But it's really something I would rather consume as a pre-packaged item than have to write this myself all the time. Especially when you multiply this across 5 or 10 teams, if they all try to implement their best practices themselves, it gets a little messy. Classic example with Kubernetes, you call kubectl apply. How long do you wait? What do you wait for? What do you check to make sure that the YAML has actually landed, if you like? The YAML has launched, but that doesn't mean that the YAML has landed. And everybody's re-implemented this 8 million different ways. That's clearly something you want a tool to be able to deliver for you. Whole bunch of other stuff. I'm not going to do the whole slide run through. You can look at it later. Many, many different domain-specific challenges around sort of more deployment than really the software build cycle. And you really would like your tooling to do this well for you. Lots and lots of other stuff, of course. I mean, going back to what we just heard, we want to do a lot of this as code. But maybe the ownership of this as code setup is shared. It's not just the development team that gets to control their entire go to production, but there is some kind of centralized ownership of part of this as well. And then you obviously want RBAC. That's a very common, you need to be able to lock down who can deploy what to which environment, et cetera, et cetera. So back to the original slide, these are the kind of challenges that Spinnaker tries to address. So basically, if we talk about what it means to be a continuous delivery platform, that's kind of what it unpacks to a little bit. So a whole bunch of companies, a lot of the members of the CDF using Spinnaker, I think, to echo what Kosuke said, I think we're very excited that the community is kind of coming together in this way. Spinnaker and Jenkins, a very, very common combination in production for lots of companies. Because there's so many lessons here that we can share with each other and that we can also share with efforts like Tecton, which is looking at this space again. I really think there's a great opportunity here to kind of come together and do lots of interesting things at this time. So maybe to motivate to go a little deeper into the question of what it means to actually do a production deployment. Surely that's just a one-line command like, gcloud run deploy or git push Heroku or something like that. Well, sure. That's true for quite a few platforms, and obviously Kubernetes tries to give a nice application developer experience here as well. But if you want to do a deployment safely, you're typically not just pushing out your brand new binary, sending all the traffic to it. Well, looks like it's okay, great. No, that's fine for, I think, for 80% of applications. I shouldn't try to stand here and overcomplicate things unnecessarily. The reality is, for many of our applications, we can do things that are just good enough. And we shouldn't necessarily overcomplicate everything. But there are plenty of applications where when we want to, it's not a good idea to break 1 million or 2 million users at a time. It's probably better to maybe break 10,000 users at a time and then increasingly gain confidence. And so these kind of processes are the things, red-black is a Spinnaker term, blue-green is what you might use commonly. These are the kind of things that you can kind of write and hand crank yourself. But the kind of things that you would like a tool to be able to provide for you. And then the sort of Spinnaker version of this, if you look at the UI, it looks much like this, and then you kind of get a status overview. We'll see what this looks like in a second when I do a bit of a demo. But you can kind of describe these processes pretty nicely. And more importantly, you can have a centralized team describe them, distribute them to like 50 or 100 development teams in your organization. They can update the centralized template in one go, and then all your teams, or 48 of the 50, will inherit that. So you don't just get the as-code benefit, but you also get this shared level of management of something like this. Skip over this. It kind of looks a little more interesting in the UI. You get a nice overview of what's running where, some kind of health check information, and so on and so forth. And then a bunch of these nice to have things that you want in a tool that really focuses on application deployment. Things like the ability to roll back or have good approvals, automated rollback strategies, and funky things like execution windows, which are maybe Friday afternoon just before you leave the office isn't the best time to do that production deployment, which of course we've all done because, yeah, we all want to get home. But, so you can have a tool to kind of prevent some of this craziness when it goes on. And then, yeah, in terms of like deployment strategies, I did a whole talk at an event recently about various types of safe deployment rollouts with Kubernetes manifests, all kinds of stuff. There's lots of stuff you can do. Kubernetes has some out-of-the-box support, but there are many more complex kind of cutover or rollover scenarios that you can have. You can have like regular blue-green where you switch all the traffic over from one to the other, but you keep the workload. You can do it in a rolling fashion, but in a more controlled fashion. You can have canary analysis in between. These are the kind of traffic patterns that Spinnaker supports. And I should add, not just for Kubernetes, obviously, it's a multi-cloud platform, so you can do quite similar things with GASP, the old-fashioned VMs that you still happen to have lying around that, of course, nobody has anymore. So to motivate an example, a nice Kubernetes example of the kind of things that you want a deployment tool to do for you, I'm going to breeze through the sets of manifest changes that you would need to hand script, if you like, if you wanted to do an Istio-based Canary rollout. Now, I'm not going to explain too much about Istio, though the point of this is not to explain this in detail, but to give a kind of idea of the amount of configuration changes that might actually be needed if you want to do this kind of stuff by hand. So, we start with 100% with my existing deployment. Then we add a whole bunch of configuration to add a canary and a baseline, and we do some traffic splitting over there, nice fun YAML to make that all work. Then we have this nice intermediate state for a while, and we do some monitoring, and we have a look at that, and then we bump it up because we want to get to the end faster, so we change our traffic distribution, so another YAML change. Then we're at this intermediate state again with a different traffic distribution, and then we decide to go ahead, so then we have to get rid of all that YAML again. And then we're at 100%. Then we do an update to our deployment object. Then we roll that out. That's just a regular Kubernetes rollout, and then, whoops, that's not how it ends. And then we're done. And so, yeah, it can all be done. It's all kubectl apply one step after the other. But it's a bit of a mess, really. And there are a couple of controllers out there that do interesting things on this level, and I think that's an interesting approach to take. But basically, the TLDR is that you want tooling to take care of this kind of stuff for you. Now, Spinnaker, talk about it as a platform, and very often it's the thing that especially if we do a demo right now, developers will see directly. But it's actually a very modular microservice-based application. That comes with its own challenges. Installing and scaling 9 or 10 microservices is certainly not the same thing as scaling a single WAR file. But there's a lot of really interesting lessons that go into building it in this way, and it allows for some very interesting scaling and optimization characteristics. And I think in many ways, it predates a lot of what's happening right now in the ecosystem as we're trying to break down CI/CD into individual functional components and figure out which ones we actually need. And I think what's interesting to see if we look across the large-scale Kubernetes users, what they do, they don't just consider Spinnaker to be a monolithic application that they use directly, but actually a whole set of individual components that are often used kind of independently of each other. So, you will extend something by using maybe the orchestrator to run a bunch of orchestrations, or maybe you will get some information out of the thing that tracks what your environment looks like. So this is a very kind of modular system, and I think going back to what we're trying to do with the CDF, or one of the things we're trying to do to rethink or to improve how we do this as an open community, I think there's a lot of interesting lessons. And so, yeah, so you get, this is from a slide from a presentation at Next. You can do lots of funky things like sharding out various parts of your architecture and backing it by lots of different types of data stores. And so you can run 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 deployments a day through this thing, and it'll scale to that. And of course, it has a resource footprint that grows as part of that. But you can totally do that, which is, I think, a very interesting thing. So, well, let me get back to that in a second. And now this is going to be very funky because now I have to try and do a demo on a tab that I can't really see. Wait, no, this is, wait, okay. Blind demos, excellent. So, Spinnaker, what does it actually look like? So you'll have to excuse me as I look back at this screen to try to make this work. So we have an application here. This is a demo application. In fact, I'm walking through a very easy to check out tutorial here. There's a link to it. And if you're interested in trying to see Spinnaker in a bit more detail, I'm just going through this walkthrough. I'm a bit ahead of things. So I have my production. Well, let's actually scale down. I have my production set up here. I've got an old version which is spun down. That means I can easily roll back to it. I've got V2 currently running. I've got 5 replica sets here if we have a look at the details. I'm not going to click into this now. It's a sort of simple application with a horrible yellow background. Part of the demo is to change that, and then I have a bunch of pipelines that are configured to take it through this process. So it's a 3-step deployment. The nice thing about splitting this out into different pipelines is I get nice different metrics for each one. I have different approvers, I have different RBAC, but I can chain them together in a pretty easy way. Nothing hugely surprising about that. So as we can see, I don't really like this this yellow background. Let's make it, why do I say green? Something like that. My blind VI skills, let's have a look. Let's commit this. Good. And then we're going to build it. This is actually using Cloud Build on the back end. I'm just pushing up a tarball. It's going to build a new Docker image. And then with a bit of luck, when the wonderful command line finishes, we will see that it's going to kick off a new pipeline in a second. So this is set up to trigger off a push to GCR, nothing amazing. Well, maybe it is. And if the demo gods are with me, then we'll see that it'll start a pipeline. And then we should push this new thing on the way to production. There we go. It's already started. Very nice. Showing some current status. While we wait for that to happen, we can, so you can see I've written out my logical flow here. You can see it's a back-end, front-end application, so we're doing some things in parallel, then we're joining them back together. We could have configured a whole bunch of nasty kind of on-failure handling flows here, which we haven't done. Let's go back. Let's leave this. It's still running. Wow, it's almost finished. Well, I'm not going to, we'll get a manual judgment in a second. I'm not going to take you all the way through this demo step by step, because I'm sure you've seen a million demos like this before. Suffice it to say, it's there's some interesting stuff worth looking at here. And then I think one of the things that's kind of maybe worth pointing out, we can see now, well, we've got a new version running in staging right now, which I'm testing, and then eventually it'll get all the way through to production, and then hopefully that background will go and be nice and white. So let me, while that's running in the background, let me talk a little. I think I'm way fast. So actually we'll have lots of time for questions because I'm speeding through this. What are we working on right now? What's happening right now? So this Spinnaker has served a lot of companies really well. And a lot of teams have found their way through the Spinnaker UI directly or done the config as code version and put pipelines in their repos and so on. But across all the large users of Spinnaker, we've seen a couple of patterns that we're looking to address as a community right now. And the first two are really around scaling operational management. Very similar to the Jenkins as code motivation. People want to capture this as an easy config that they can put in their code, and they also want to make it easier for development teams to get bootstrapped on this. So typically what you want is when a development team starts a new project, ideally you want them to go to some nice UI or to use some command line or whatever, and then they punch in a few variables like, is it a gold tier application or a silver tier application? Am I using Go or Java or Ruby or whatever? And then everything should kind of be set up for you if you get it right. Like you have a repo, you have a bug tracker, you have a continuous delivery pipeline set up, you have some CI jobs set up. I think that's where many companies, that's where we see they want to go. And so we've invested, everything in Spinnaker is API-able. But we've invested in a new command line interface that makes it much easier to kind of automate these workflows if you're looking to combine them in this kind of setup tooling. And of course, if you want to do any kind of generic API automation, having a CLI is quite nice as well. We're revamping the template setup a little bit. Spinnaker already has templating for pipelines internally, but it does a bunch of, for instance, variable resolution on the back-end side that we would like to take out. And so the experience around that is kind of being sharpened up a little bit so that you have a nice experience where you can design a pipeline in the UI, for instance, because that's actually pretty nice to initially get it started. I think my personal experience, one of the most frustrating parts of config as code is the initial development experience. I'm sure many of us have these branches in our repo where you like, oh, change the YAML, commit, try again. Change the YAML, oh, it broke, try again. Like, it's not a lot of fun to get that initial config as code set up right. And so we're looking for a flow where you can do that rapid development, if you like, of your config really effectively in the UI, because it's nice and visual and you can test it easily by just hitting run now, run now. And then when you're done with that, then you can export it easily as code, templatize it, share it with other teams, lock it down, and do the kind of things that you want to do in order to be able to share it amongst lots of teams. And then the last one, declarative delivery, which I think is the most ambitious but potentially also the most promising part of what we're doing, is to take a step back and look at how people are really thinking about shipping software from dev to prod. Thinking about it in terms of a process or thinking about it in terms of pipelines has been a very common metaphor that we've used, and thanks to Jez and Dave in their book for giving us this kind of metaphor. But at the end of the day, it's still very do this, then that, then do something else. And that's okay, but one of the things that, especially around Kubernetes, but in general, in fact, in the industry, we've tried to get away from is that, whether we're looking at Terraform or whether we're looking at the reconciliation engine that's inside Kubernetes or Pulumi or lots of other examples, we're trying to move away from the idea of, say, tell a system do this, then that, then do something else, to this is kind of roughly what I want you to, the setup that I want, the structure that I want. How do I make that work? And it's a pattern we've seen across a large number of large-scale Spinnaker users. They don't really want to, or they don't think that the best way for teams to interact with it is to build all their own pipelines, because that's quite time-consuming, and they're all a little bit different. So they use sort of templates, but really what they want is for a team to be able to say something like, okay, how many environments do I have? Maybe staging and prod. What are the conditions under which I deploy to any particular environment? Well, maybe staging happens when I tag my repo, or maybe it happens once a day, or maybe it happens when all the artifacts are ready. When do I go to prod? Well, maybe when I've run all my tests in staging. What's the strategy I want to use for prod? Do I want it to be super safe, or do I want it to be super fast? Or, as Tracy was saying earlier, maybe I can have both. And this, if you think about it that way, we're not really saying which steps to run in which particular sequence. We're declaring the intent of our delivery process. And so what Spinnaker is doing is adding a bunch of services in a description format where teams, instead of having to specify pipelines and processes, they specify their delivery on a kind of environment-by-environment basis with the conditions and the strategies that are supposed to be used. And then it's the job of the tool to generate the pipelines for you and to manage them for you and to update them for you and those kind of things. And sure, that's not going to cover 100% of use cases. Like there's always the crazy application with, oh, there's because my screen falling asleep. There's always the crazy application with the 8 million database changes that you need to make and all that kind of stuff that you don't want to, that you can't possibly capture in this kind of abstracted format. But the point is we don't need to cover 100% of use cases to deliver a lot of value. If you can meet 80 or 90% of the use cases in an organization with a structured declarative format, then continuous delivery, I think, will become a lot easier and it'll become a lot safer. And thus, if you take the original statement and you modify a little bit, then I think where we're trying to head is to go from being a continuous delivery platform to a declarative delivery platform. And what that'll give us is it'll go from doing application release to doing simplified application release. And I think that's a very interesting and compelling community journey that I'm really looking forward to taking on, not just as part of the Spinnaker community, but of course as part of the larger CDF as well. Because I think there's lots of interesting concepts here that we can distill out and put in a whole bunch of different places. I'm not going to walk through all of these. There's a bunch of link slides here that we'll share these slides so you can click on any of these and try it. The code lab, the one that I was going through, by the way, if you're interested in trying it, is this one up here. And before I wrap up, let's see how our demo went. Let's see what we end up getting. We've got still a pipeline waiting for us. Let's have a look. Where are we stuck? Oh, we're still waiting on this one. Well, I forgot to approve that. We're trying to be safe. That's fine. So now we're doing the production rollout, and I guess I will end up ending on that once that's done. So that's my slides. Thank you very much.